Welcome to the deep dive. We're so thrilled to have you with us today for this custom-tailored journey. Our mission is simple, but honestly pretty ambitious.
Oh, definitely
Yeah,
ambitious.
we are going to give you a shortcut to being well-informed about the very foundations of the human mind. So, if you are someone who constantly asks why we do the things we do, but you get, completely overwhelmed at the thought of slogging through a dense academic textbook, well, you are in the exact right place.
It is entirely understandable to be intimidated by the sheer volume of psychological literature out there. It is a vast, heavily layered field.
Oh, for sure.
But the sources we are drawing from today are perfect for your learning style. We're looking at excerpts and a comprehensive summary of a really brilliant guide called The Little Book of Psychology.
Yeah, that's written by Emily Ralls, co-authored with Caroline Riggs.
Right, and their work is specifically designed to demystify these massive pivotal concepts and the historical figures who shaped them. It makes the science of the mind accessible without watering down the actual genius behind it.
And what a history it is, honestly. The story of trying to figure out our own brains goes back incredibly far. I think we often picture psychology as folks in lab coats with clipboards, but the initial debates were literally happening in togas.
What's fascinating here is that the origins of human thoughts and behaviors have actually intrigued us for at least 2.5 millennia. We are talking about debates that date all the way back to ancient Greece.
Wow.
You had early thinkers like Hippocrates, who made a truly monumental, correct guess for his time. He posited that it is actually the brain and not the heart that acts as the control center for human consciousness.
Which is a massive leap of logic for that era. Because if you think about it from the perspective of an ancient philosopher, when you get nervous, your heart races.
Exactly.
When you feel love or grief, you feel it right in your chest. So it makes intuitive sense that people firmly believed the heart was the seat of the soul and the mind.
Absolutely.
We even had later theories like Galen's pump model of the brain, trying to physically explain how our unseen thoughts might sort of slosh around our bodies.
It was a very mechanical view of something incredibly abstract.
Right. Okay, let's unpack this because for centuries, what we now call psychology wasn't actually a science at all.
Not even close.
It was purely philosophy. It was great thinkers sitting around debating the abstract nature of the soul, but without any real way to measure it or weigh it or test it.
Which is why the big pivot is so important. The moment psychology stepped out of the philosopher's armchair and into the laboratory happened in the 1800s.
And for that, we have to introduce a name that every psychology student learns on day one, which is Wilhelm Wundt.
Yes, Wundt. He lived from 1832 to 1920.
He is essentially the guy who decided that we could study human behavior using the actual scientific method.
Wundt is a foundational figure for that exact reason. In 1874, he published a landmark book titled Principles of Physiological Psychology.
The title itself is a huge clue.
It really is. It points to his revolutionary approach. He was officially linking human physiology, our physical, biological workings, with our behavior and our conscious thoughts.
And he didn't just write about it.
No, he put it into practice. In 1879, he established the very first Institute for Experimental Psychology in Leipzig, Germany.
That is just huge. That was the moment psychology was given its own physical home as a distinct scientific discipline.
Complete with controlled environments and specialized instruments.
The way he ran that institute is a perfect snapshot of a science in its infancy, too. Wundt pioneered a signature research method called introspection.
Looking inward.
Literally looking inward.
Yeah.
The way it worked in his Leipzig lab was basically a highly controlled self-examination. Wundt would bring participants in, present them with very specific sensory stimuli, maybe the steady ticking of a metronome, or a colored light, or a sharp sound.
Right.
And then he'd ask them to deeply examine and report their internal cognitive processes. They had to describe exactly what they were feeling and thinking in that exact moment.
He really thought that by controlling the environment, he could map out the human mind the way a chemist maps out the elements.
But of course, there's a catch.
Yes, that ambition is commendable, but here is where we need to apply some critical thinking. If we look closely at Wundt's method, there is a fundamental flaw that our text points out. Introspection relies entirely on subjective self-reports. You can never truly verify what another person is experiencing internally. Because of that subjectivity, introspection faced massive critiques regarding its reliability and objectivity.
Because you simply couldn't universally verify the data.
Exactly, which is the cornerstone of the scientific method.
Right, because my internal experience of hearing a loud noise might be a spike of anxiety, and a memory of a car crash.
And mine might be a completely different cascade of thoughts.
And honestly, neither of us can perfectly articulate those rapid-fire internal thoughts anyway.
That lack of universal articulation is the exact reason introspection failed as a reliable long-term methodology. The scientific method requires variables that can be independently observed and measured.
They have to be observable.
Right. As the field constantly evolves, modern psychological science strongly favors observable behavior over subjective self-reports.
Which is a big theme in the sources we're looking at.
It is. The source text actually emphasizes this shift, urging you, the reader, to maintain a critical eye on tradition. It even suggests looking into diverse modern texts like Psychology, The Science of Mind and Behavior by Michael Passer and Ronald Smith.
That's a great recommendation.
It gives you a more well-rounded contemporary view of how we study the mind today. Wundt started the fire, but the methodology had to radically change to survive.
Here's where it gets really interesting, because as the 19th century progressed, the focus started shifting from just asking people about their abstract thoughts to actually looking at the physical organ itself.
The brain.
The brain. There were a series of morbid yet entirely groundbreaking experiments during this era that mapped out the brain's electrical signaling. But nothing put biological psychology on the map, quite like the tragic, wildly famous case of Phineas Gage in 1848.
The Phineas Gage story is a true watershed moment in medical history. Gage was a railroad construction foreman who survived an absolutely horrific accident.
Horrific is almost an understatement.
An explosive charge went off prematurely, driving a large iron rod straight up through his skull.
A tamping iron, right.
Yes, it entered under his cheekbone and exited through the top of his head, destroying a significant portion of his brain in the process.
And he lived. He was walking and talking shortly after the accident, which is mind-boggling.
It really is.
But the reason he is a staple in every psychology textbook isn't his survival skills. It's what happened to his personality. Before the iron rod, Gage was known as a capable, efficient, and well-balanced man, a good manager.
Very reliable.
But after the injury, his personality radically altered. He became highly impulsive, he showed a complete lack of anger control, and he could no longer stick to plans or act appropriately in social situations. He was, as his friends noted at the time, no longer Gage.
This tragedy provided a massive scientific breakthrough. Gage gave the medical community some of the very first concrete evidence proving a direct link between physical brain damage and behavioral changes.
It localized the function.
Exactly. Specifically, the damage he sustained highlighted the critical role of the frontal lobe. Through Gage and subsequent advances in brain imaging techniques over the next century, we now know definitively that the frontal lobe is fundamentally responsible for impulse control.
It showed that our personalities, our tempers, our very sense of self are not just floating ethereal concepts.
No, they're anchored deeply in our biology.
Which brings up a great point about how we view the physical brain today. I want to use this moment to debunk one of the most persistent, frustrating pieces of pop culture mythology out there.
Let me guess, the 10% myth.
Yes. The idea that humans only use 10% of their brains, it is a total fabrication. We use our entire brain.
We really do.
As the source material outlines, the neurons in our brain transmit electrical impulses at remarkable speeds throughout the entire structure. They communicate constantly using neurotransmitters. While certain areas might light up more depending on the specific task you're doing, your whole brain is highly active all the time.
To help you visualize this constant activity, we can map out the architecture of the brain right now.
Let's do it.
It is divided into 4 main sections called lobes, and each is specialized for distinct functions. Let's put this into an everyday scenario. Imagine you are navigating a busy, chaotic airport.
Sounds stressful already.
It is. We just mentioned the first lobe, the frontal lobe. This is where your executive functions live. It handles your decision-making, your creative problem-solving when a flight is delayed, and as we saw with Phineas Gage, your impulse control, which keeps you from yelling at the gate agent.
Right. And then right behind that, on the sides of your head, you have the temporal lobe. Think of this as your brain's filing cabinet and dictionary. When you are listening to the overhead announcements and trying to process the language, or remembering the gate number you just read on the screen, your temporal lobe is doing the heavy lifting.
Perfect analogy. Then, located near the upper back area of the skull is the parietal lobe.
What does that one do?
This lobe is all about perception and the interpretation of sensory input. When you feel the heavy strap of your carry-on bag digging into your shoulder, or you notice the sudden blast of cold air conditioning as you walk into a new terminal, your parietal lobe is processing that tactile information.
And finally, right at the very back of your head is the occipital lobe. This one is dedicated almost entirely to visual processing.
Right.
When you are scanning a sea of strangers and instantly recognize your travel companion waving at you from a coffee shop, you have your occipital lobe to thank for that lightning-fast facial recognition.
Every inch of that real estate is spoken for and constantly working. But what is truly remarkable is that this architecture isn't rigid. The brain doesn't just passively process the world, it actively reshapes itself based on your interaction with it.
The brain is unbelievably adaptable. This brings us to a concept that completely changed how we view the human mind: neuroplasticity.
Such a game changer.
For a long time, people thought that once you reached adulthood, your brain was fixed, like a computer whose hardware couldn't be upgraded. But neuroplasticity is the brain's ability to physically change its structure and reorganize its connections based on your experiences and what you learn.
And the book highlights arguably the most memorable example of this ever recorded.
The London taxi drivers.
Yes, the London taxi driver study is a classic in biological psychology. To get a license to drive a traditional black cab in London, you have to pass a grueling test known as the knowledge.
I've heard it takes years.
It does. It requires memorizing the labyrinth of thousands of complex city routes, one-way streets, and landmarks perfectly without relying on GPS.
Wow.
Researchers took brain scans of these drivers and discovered something incredible. Their hippocampi, the specific part of the brain heavily involved in spatial memory and navigation, were physically enlarged compared to the average person.
They literally grew their brains just by studying and memorizing city streets. It physically altered their biology. Which makes me wonder what my hippocampus looks like, considering I get lost in my own neighborhood without my phone.
I think a lot of us rely a bit too heavily on our phones these days.
Definitely. But it proves that your brain is more like a muscle that bulks up with use, rather than a fixed machine.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, it leads us directly into the evolutionary perspective of psychology. Just as the brain adapts over a single lifetime through neuroplasticity, human behavior has adapted over millions of years.
Applying Charles Darwin's theory to the mind.
Precisely. It applies the theory of natural selection to psychology. It argues that our modern behaviors are fundamentally shaped by the adaptation pressures faced by our ancestors in their early environments. The traits and behaviors that helped early humans survive on the savannah were passed down through the generations.
Which is an incredibly helpful lens when you think about why we aren't all just completely selfish, ruthless survivalists. You'd think survival of the fittest means every person for themselves.
Right, but evolutionary psychology explains why that isn't true at all. Pure selfishness is actually a terrible long-term survival strategy for a social species.
Because you'd be on your own.
Exactly. If you are a lone wolf in the ancient world, you are highly vulnerable. Traits like altruism, which is helping others at a personal cost to yourself, and cooperative behaviors dramatically enhance the survival chances of early human communities.
They needed each other to survive.
By working together, sharing scarce food resources, and protecting one another from predators, entire communities thrived. Because those cooperative, empathetic groups survived, they were the ones who propagated their genes. Our modern drive to connect, to conform, and to help our neighbors is deeply encoded in our evolutionary biology because it kept our ancestors alive.
It makes you wonder where biological psychology is headed next. The source touches on the exciting future of this field, and it honestly sounds like science fiction, but it is happening right now.
Oh, the technological leaps are staggering.
We are moving toward incredibly advanced portable MRI technology that can scan brains out in the real world while people are moving around, rather than just lying perfectly still in a clinical tube.
That changes the game for observable data.
And even more mind-blowing, researchers are actively growing actual brain matter from skin cells in order to study severe disorders like Alzheimer's and autism in real time, safely in a petri dish. The frontiers are just wide open.
It is a field defined by constant, rapid discovery anchored in measurable biology. But to really appreciate this modern, observable science, we actually need to take a step back and look at an era when psychology was much messier.
Oh, yes.
It was highly theoretical and full of drama. We have to look at the historical theories that radically shaped our cultural understanding of the mind, even if they couldn't be measured in a lab.
we absolutely cannot talk about the history of psychology without talking about the drama. Let's pivot to chapter 3 of the text, which dives into the psychodynamic approach.
You can't say psychodynamic without immediately thinking of one man.
Sigmund Freud. Regardless of what you think of his theories today, he is a towering figure.
Absolutely.
But his backstory is surprisingly relatable. He wasn't always this iconic cigar-smoking psychoanalyst analyzing dreams. Freud was born in Moravia, later moved to Vienna, and originally, he actually wanted to be a lawyer.
It was only later that he pivoted his focus entirely to medicine and eventually psychology. He lived from 1856 to 1939. He started out pioneering the use of hypnosis as a treatment for what was then broadly and vaguely diagnosed as hysteria.
Right, the early days of clinical treatment.
From those early clinical experiences, where patients would reveal hidden traumas, he began to formulate entirely new concepts about the unconscious mind. He eventually published his highly influential work, The Interpretation of Dreams.
His cultural legacy is massive. We use his concepts in everyday language without even realizing it. Have you ever accidentally called your boss mom?
Hopefully not out loud.
Or meant to compliment someone but accidentally insulted them? That is a Freudian slip. It's his idea that your unconscious mind is accidentally leaking out your true, hidden desires or anxieties through a slip of the tongue.
Freud introduced several foundational concepts alongside the Freudian slip. Most notably, he developed a tripartite model of personality. He suggested the mind is divided into three conflicting parts: the id, the ego, and the superego.
A classic trio.
The id represents our primal, impulsive biological urges. It wants immediate gratification. The superego represents strict societal morality and our internalized conscience. And the ego is the rational mediator stuck in the middle, trying to balance our wild urges with our moral constraints.
So the ego is constantly playing referee.
Exactly. Freud argued that this constant internal battle is what generates human anxiety. His influence was so magnetic that he founded the Psychological Wednesday Society, a gathering of brilliant minds in his living room that eventually evolved into the massive International Psychoanalytic Association.
But, and this is a critical distinction, the expert consensus today is very different.
The modern critical counterweight provided in the text is essential to mention. While Freud's cultural impact is undeniable, many of his core theories have fallen heavily out of favor in contemporary scientific psychology.
Mostly because they're impossible to prove.
Precisely. The primary reason is that his ideas are largely untestable. Unlike measuring the enlarged hippocampus of a taxi driver, you cannot empirically measure or observe an unconscious id in a laboratory.
And the social context was very rigid.
Yes. Furthermore, his theories are heavily critiqued for being highly male-centered and a product of a very specific repressed Victorian society, making them incredibly difficult to apply universally to modern human behavior.
The history of the psychodynamic approach is also full of intense interpersonal drama. Freud attracted brilliant followers, but he demanded absolute loyalty to his specific ideas.
He did not handle dissent well.
Not at all. The most famous example of this is his collaboration with another titan of psychology, Carl Jung. Initially, they were incredibly close colleagues. Freud viewed Jung almost like a protege and the heir to the psychoanalytic movement.
But their relationship turned bitter and contentious.
The breaking point was largely over their strong disagreements regarding Freud's Oedipus complex.
For context, the Oedipus complex was Freud's highly controversial theory suggesting that children have an unconscious sexual desire for their opposite-sex parent and view their same-sex parent as a rival.
Yeah.
Jung simply couldn't get on board with this intense focus on childhood sexuality as the root of all unconscious behavior. Jung wanted to break away and explore broader, more spiritual concepts of the unconscious mind.
But Freud wasn't having it.
Freud viewed his theories as absolute doctrine and could not accept the dissent.
The fallout between them was permanent. It splintered the psychodynamic movement and stands as a classic example of how deeply personal these scientific and philosophical debates were at the time.
It was a huge fracture in the field.
And Freud's timeline takes a somber turn toward the end of his life as well. Because he was Jewish, the horrific rise of the Nazis in the 1930s forced him to flee his longtime home in Vienna. He spent his final years in exile in London, where he continued to write and refine his theories until his death.
It's a heavy end to a very complex life.
So what does this all mean? We have covered an incredible journey today. We started with Wilhelm Wundt, trying to measure the mind in a lab using just the sound of a metronome and people's unreliable self-reports.
To the physical brain.
Right, then we moved into the brutal physical mapping of the brain, courtesy of Phineas Gage and that iron rod, proving our personalities live in our biology. We marveled at the shape-shifting, adaptable brains of London taxi drivers, proving neuroplasticity.
And explored human evolution.
Yes, how evolution shaped our desire to help each other. And finally, we waded into the wild, untestable, but culturally massive theories of Sigmund Freud and his dramatic falling out with Carl Jung.
If we synthesize all of that, the value of this deep dive becomes clear. You, the listener, are investing time in understanding these foundations for a reason.
Definitely.
By grasping how our biology, our evolutionary history, and our past theories all intersect to shape our actions, you are equipping yourself with an incredible tool. Understanding the mechanics behind human behavior, why we feel anxious when our id and superego clash, why we act impulsively if our frontal lobe is compromised, why we conform to a group because of ancient survival instincts. It helps you navigate the modern world with far more empathy and clarity.
It's like having the user manual for your own mind.
Exactly. It allows you to step back and understand your own impulses, rather than just being a passage into them. This raises an important question for you to take away today.
Okay, let's hear it.
We talked about neuroplasticity, the undeniable scientific fact that our brains are constantly rewiring and reshaping themselves based on our daily routines and our environments, just like those London taxi drivers whose brains literally grew from studying the city streets. So consider your own life. If every action is leaving a physical mark, what everyday habits, what daily routines are physically reshaping the structure of your brain right now?
Oh, that is such a fascinating, slightly intimidating, but mostly empowering question to end on. Thank you so much for joining us on this custom deep dive into the foundations of psychology. We hope this shortcut to understanding the mind leaves you feeling informed, curious, and ready to take a closer look at the world around you. Until next time, keep pondering that lingering thought and take care of your brain.